Hey everybody, this is the ESOP Guy. We are on a journey to an ESOP and beyond. We are in our 5th season and super excited to come to you today to talk through something I think is really, really helpful and kind of probably new to a lot of people that haven't really talked through private equity. As we go into it, we're going to talk a little bit about a program that some of the we're seeing private equity and how they're playing in the employee ownership space. To do that, we're going to interview Jason Miller. Jason Miller is brand new to our team when it comes down to the ESOP Guy group. And so, but we're going to walk through some things I think are going to be super, super helpful for you. If you are brand new to the podcast, it is a resource that we've produced to really be something that could be helpful as, you know, learning more about employee stock ownership plans and generally kind of what's happening in employee ownership space as well. You can go to our website at journeytoanesop.com and check out all of our episodes. If you're not new, thank you guys for joining today. Hopefully it's a good day as we go through this. Jason, thank you and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Phillip. Very happy to be here.
Cool. So just kind of bridging you into the podcast. I know it's kind of our tradition to jump into like, what's your favorite movie and why? And that's always kind of helpful for people to better know you.
So much to choose from. But of those, I would have to say that the Lord of the Rings trilogy, if I have to choose a story versus an individual movie, would be my favorite. As a kid, I loved reading the books, what was available for that outlet, and then seeing them come to life on screen was very endearing to me, and to see that part of my childhood become live. And so really, really enjoyed those, despite some of the changes that were made. They're popular or unpopular.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they never can make it perfect to the book. But so of the 3 movies, what's the favorite movie? I mean, that, you know, putting you in a corner, but obviously it fits together, right? It's one big story.
It really does. I really enjoyed The Two Towers more than the other 2. If I had to pick a favorite, it was the one in the middle.
Yeah, the last one was like, oh my gosh, people are skeletons or the ghosts are coming out of the mountain, right? And
yes, yep.
Everybody. Yeah, cool. Well, great. Well, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to, you know, what we're doing on the ESOP Guy front. Tell us a little bit about your story when it comes to ESOP world. Like, how did you get involved in the ESOP world itself? What attracted you to that space, and kind of why have you chosen to kind of transition into more what we're doing?
Great question. So my career started in banking and retail banking, and then I did a stint as a financial advisor, and then came back and really worked with small businesses, almost micro businesses. My career continued to kind of evolve through a number of years in the commercial banking space. And throughout that time, my approach to clients was really, what are you going to do next? Like, how can we, instead of playing a tennis match over, I'm a bank, here's what I have to offer, let's work together. And what does that mean, working together? What are we working toward? And probably early on, it was a matter of generating that context, right? So if your goals are to grow your company, and then what happens when you don't want to be there anymore? What happens in that transition? And then what part do I play as a lender, as a banker, as an advisor in that conversation to actually help you and partner? And I would say that perspective led me through understanding credit and risk and its position in that relationship, and how it helps to fuel and fund both that dream and that exit, whatever it might be. And then as I started thinking more about exits, there's only a few, right? There's limited options, infinite iterations. And as a lender, one of those that made a lot of sense for me to explore was ESOPs. And over a number of years, worked within the organization and partners to bring together a program and a strategy for the last institution I was with to expand ESOPs and our ESOP lending group for formations and existing companies, and to grow that portfolio. Because it makes sense. It's a debt solution to a company, and the exit portion of that fit within that path of mine that I took as a professional.
Awesome. When you saw, because at a national bank level, right, with a large national bank, you saw a lot of the ESOP world from a lot of different vantage points, obviously from the finance side, but also kind of in that sense of what's happening at those levels. How would you describe like the ESOP, like over the last couple of years, the trends in towards the companies looking at ESOPs as an option? How would you describe the kind of the also the other side of things is like how companies are experiencing that, either whether they're brand new to ESOPs or they're existing ESOPs?
So I would say definitively the interest in ESOPs is up year over year over the last number of years. And it's at all ranges. There's a lot of very attractive qualities to undergoing employee ownership in general, from an operation standpoint to an exit standpoint, but then and all the benefits that come along with an ESOP transaction, potentially for sellers, definitely for the company, either in the short or the long term. And then the culture that it kind of retains and grows along with it. So there's a lot of interest in that. Whether it's because of the baby boomer generation and they're finally thinking, I got to do something, I have to act, or whether things are happening to them that force them to act and examine options, whatever the impetus is, it's happening. And really at all levels, owners are being curious about, well, hey, what's out there that's different? What is my experience? What am I hearing? Who's contacting me? And then what really are my options? And expanding that dialogue, I think, is one of the most important thing that any advisor can do, is just laying those out. You know, what do you want to accomplish? What are you trying to do? What would a perfect exit look like for you? And as they put words to a vision, then it helps to select, here's what I have available to me in my company, in my geography, in my company's size, in my industry, because all of those things matter to what's available to a company. And they're being curious, I think, is what's spurring that activity.
Yeah, and so that's a good place to segue into the topic as we talk about private equity. And you're talking about like the idea of, hey, we have as an exit possibly, and that's not every person who's thinking about an ESOP. That's not the completely, the whole thing on their mind, but it's definitely something that is going to be on their mind. Like how many exit the business? When it comes down to it, there are a couple different options. When we think about like the first part of this is to understand like private equity versus an ESOP. And how would you, if we just took that road, if I go looking at private equity, we can kind of bump that into like maybe more strategic sales or whatever, but specific to private equity, because that's what we're going to talk about today, versus going into an employee stock ownership plan route. What would you say are kind of like the differences for people that are looking at that saying, hey, this is the direction I want to go? And what kind of advice would you give them if they're not sure exactly what path they want to go on to?
Yeah. So one of the major differences is the individual shareholders. What do they want to get out of a transaction? And then what is their timeline? So private equity is very, very good at transacting very, very fast for companies that they want. And companies that they want turns out to be, what is their fund for? What are they trying to target? How are they trying to build that into their portfolio? What makes sense for their model? And then what cash do they have available to do it? And what leverage can they apply in order to make the most of those opportunities? And because there is additional money coming into a transaction from the private equity group to make the purchase, it offers a lot more liquidity up front for a shareholder. And so if the weight is on liquidity and personal application, then there's a reason to explore that if the company fits the profile of a private equity target. Conversely, in an ESOP, it's a leverage buyout, right? So it's a 100% debt financed leverage buyout. It has those tax advantages that we talked about that may accelerate some of that repayment, but you can't convert the entire equity stack into debt and then expect it to work if there's an outside party that's involved. And so the normal structure that I know that you've talked about here on the podcast of a senior lender taking a chunk, and then the sellers taking back their note, which is a common ESOP structure, is what provides the ability for that 100% transaction to occur. But those sellers are going to wait. Mm-hmm. They get something for waiting, but they're going to wait instead of the alternative of possibly selling out to a private equity firm. And that gets into deal structure some, right, in that regard. And we can talk on strategics too, if you'd like.
Yeah, I think we'll kind of stay with private equity versus ESOP, and then we'll get into some other things. But I think respective to private equity versus ESOP, one of the other distinctions I would make is just the idea that who is the buyer and what's going to happen to the company afterwards. I've had, and I know you've had this too, like a lot of people, when they get down to that, some of them have experienced, they've gone through the whole process. And then either right at the end or during the process, they're like, this is really not what I want to do, because what I'm doing really is going to disrupt the legacy of this company. And this is really, and I've always been kind of careful to say, like, private equity is there for a reason, and it's very useful, but it's not always, when I look at the ESOP route, sometimes it's not the route that an owner wants to take when they want to kind of keep in the consistency of what they've built and the legacy of that. So I think that's a major distinction between the two things, because private equity really is going to try to maximize the return on what they've just purchased. And on the advantage that the owner gets is, like, they might get more cash up front, like you talked about. However, they also are leaving the company behind, and they're not going to have a role that they would likely have under the ESOP. So just kind of the quality of the deals and the sense of what people are looking for, goals and objectives, are definitely distinctly different.
I completely agree. And I think it's important to note that there's no wrong personal choice for an owner to do what they feel is in their best interest. And that's something that, as many of them go through this process, understanding what options are available, what it means to them, what those differences are, and really choosing for themselves what they've earned, because they've grown the company, they've built the company. It's theirs. That value is what's owed to them. How they get it out and then what happens afterward is definitely a key consideration. But for them, if that's their goal, it's not a wrong answer. And some of the math functions too, if you think about certain industries, we go back to industry, have very large multiples because of what they're in. And an ESOP might not be able to get those owners that same multiple, even over time, not just up front, but over time. And when you think about a completely debt financed transaction versus outside equity plus some leverage, then the math doesn't work for the cash flows of the company beyond a certain point, given interest rates and given debt structure in an ESOP transaction in private equity. So industry is super important on what's available. It also gets to company size. Usually the larger the company and the more sustainable and repeatable their income, then the more options they have in this iteration. The last thing that I'd probably say in this is, in the beginning, it might have to be either or it might be a partial for an ESOP to maintain that culture, to grow that company, to give everyone skin in the game, which is a huge, huge push right now. I say push, more movement in that space. And then growing that company with them, with that benefit, and then thinking later about a different exit for the whole company. And we've seen that a number of times over the years, where partial ESOPs have grown, and then they have made a transition either to a financial buyer or another strategic buyer, and then everyone benefits under that structure.
Yeah, kind of like a stepping stone, start with this, and then you get to the next step, which is a bigger, a master plan or whatever. Interest rates obviously has played a big role in all of this as well over the last several years, right? We've seen the interest rates climbing. The math for the private equity guys changes dramatically when the interest rates are higher. And so, there is some changes. I would say there's changes obviously to an ESOP structure transaction, but not as dramatically on the private equity side, because they are relying a lot more on financing as opposed to just, hey, we have tons of cash and we're just going to plow that into every company we see.
Very, very rate of return driven, right? Because they have to deliver. And that's the way that the model is set up. So rising costs are going to depress those returns under, same scenario or conditions.
Yeah. So, and I think that's why one of the things I always try to tell people at the front end when they're thinking about doing an ESOP is really understand the differences between these different alternatives. Because you can save a lot of money and time by not running down that road and realizing, oh, I didn't realize that's really what that is all about when you get down to it. And so, I think there's probably room to do a whole episode on just private equity or strategic buyers or all of that. What I wanted to kind of segue into and transition into is just the idea of the expanding ESOP initiative and what that means in terms of how private equity is now playing a role. And some of this stuff is overlapping a little bit. And I know that you, in your prior life to join our practice, were kind of involved in that. And I know there's a lot of things that are probably brand new in that sense. So I think it's kind of an exciting topic to jump in and explain a little bit of what that really means. So we talk about expanding ESOP initiatives. First off, what are we even talking about when you get done?
So great question. Thank you for the question. So I'll unpack it by starting with the great news is that a lot of leaders in the financial world and private equity have taken notice of the impact of employee ownership, what that means to a company, and then kind of definitive results in bottom line. Like there's value created by sharing. And in that idea of if we give more broad-based employee ownership to employees of companies, regardless of where the company is and who, the private equity or strategic or ESOP, ESOPs have been that core of what employee ownership is all about. So the performance of ESOP companies and the performance of companies that have other employee ownership plans is very definitive. And that being taken notice, it's how do we do that? How do we do more of that? A number of ESOP leaders were gathered together and kind of thought through this process on where do ESOPs apply today? Where is that marketplace? Where does it make sense? And then how can we expand that marketplace? Because the particular benefits of an ESOP structure are very, very powerful. Not just financially for the owner, not just financially for the company, but the difference that it makes in the individual lives of those employees. And one of the pieces of information that I found most fascinating as we went through and looked at this work, the largest disparity in wealth is direct equity ownership. So those that have direct equity ownership have more wealth. Those that don't have significantly less over time. And as time has gone on, that gap has only grown. And so how do we help correct that? How can you influence that on a broader basis? And it's utilizing the tools that are already available and the community that's already here, and just expanding that, not replacing it, not changing it, not bringing anything new, except for ideas and application. And so that you'll see in the news recently, there's a segment on 60 Minutes a number of weeks ago that highlighted the value of employee ownership and what some of those firms are doing in the marketplace with their approach to purchases. And even recently, there was another that announced a similar approach in their deals. Beyond that, it's, again, how do we make the lives of individuals better? And then as employee or as owners, as shareholders, what can we be thinking about in our transition that allows us to do that, to preserve that legacy that you talked about, so that everyone is better? Rising tide lifts all ships.
Yeah, I think that's really, so a lot of things that we're getting into in terms of first off, the financial community seeing that, this is definitely a real thing, right? I mean, it's not just something that, as we talk about in the podcast, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of statistics that support, and it makes logical sense. If an employee has ownership in a stake in the business, they're not going to think the same way if they really understand what that means to them and their families from a long term. So it is absolutely, clear, I think, hopefully to most people, that direct equity ownership is going to lead to more wealth. And when you don't have that, you're basically building a 401k plan with a lot of diversification and, and looking at the stock market, hopefully, or whatever you're investing in, to do well for you over time. But it's not going to be the same thing as the appreciation of a small middle market company appreciating over time in their stock value. So that's clear. So the initiative on the 60 minutes, obviously you were kind of part of that. And so the idea behind, and what we're going to do, just so everybody knows, we're going to put that link on our website at journeytoanesop.com. So you can, after we air this or whatever, before we air this, you can go right on and check out the link. But that whole kind of thought leadership program collaboratively, who was involved in that? Like what kind of people were there? Obviously private equity people, right? So kind of give us like a bit of the who's in the room type of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I say kind of ESOP leaders, it's a small community, but your practice executives, from sell-side advisors, from banks, from ESOP attorneys, valuation trustees, the folks that have been in the ESOP community for a long, long time, and then folks that have been in the ESOP community for less time, working in conjunction on how in the world can we share this gem, right, with more people, and where can that opportunity be found. And so it's getting all the folks together that know as much as anyone can know about ESOPs, and then collaborating on what that could look like in context of an idea. And one of the links that we'll share will take you to a website that details the work that's been done there. And I think that a lot of people will be excited to read not just the background information on ESOPs and educational piece, but that broader application and what it could mean to the economy as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Right. So when they, and obviously you're part of the group, right? When they got everybody in the room, they just kind of brainstorm the ideas behind how do you leverage this idea better into the market? So and really, what was the goal? What was the goal of the meeting? I guess is kind of where I'm going.
That's a great question. And so there's a lot of investment that was done in research to figure out where can this be applied, and what does that idea generate. So there's a basis of an idea under our proposal that you'll see on the website as a whole. But really the meeting was, we think there's a huge upside here, that there should be a lot more ESOPs. Why aren't there more ESOPs? And then what can we agree on in the approach that the community takes to expand this? Because there's no good in disrupting what works. There's at the expense of what works for a new application. And so it was a great working group to collaborate and say, what can we agree on? What are our principles? What are our core principles? And it's starting out with do no harm. Anything that gets talked about, or anything that progresses from here, should not in any way, shape, or form infringe or impose on the existing structure of S Corp ESOP, 1042, C Corp, all of the things that we all know and love today about ESOPs. It's just more. And that took a lot of time and a lot of talk. And then in the proposal, right, the detailed proposal is like, what about this? What about this idea for C Corp ESOPs to attract more buyers, right, and to attract a different market? And how do we make more ESOPs as a community using the resources and the talent that's in the community? And I can't tell you, having that many people in the room that many times, just how it was a great working group. You wouldn't know that there were competitors in that group across all those spectrums, right? Because of the way that the ESOP community works together. And so it's really a testament to that group and to those leaders that brought us together for that concept.
Yeah. And again, I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to pick apart the meeting a little bit. So I think it's super interesting to kind of think about these types of forums where, and the hope is everything gets better. Right. But the one thing that always is always on everybody's mind is like, why? I think there's 7,000 ESOPs in the country, right? Amongst how many, companies in the United States, right? And so what were some of the reasons that you picked up on that they said, hey, why are there not more ESOPs just in general?
Some of that was in the research that was done by the leaders, right? And so few people know what an ESOP is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the statistic is of the research pool or whatnot that was done, like 3% of people knew what an ESOP was.
Wow.
And then, Phillip, you've done 5 seasons. You're on 5 seasons of the ESOP guy with all of those topics.
Yep.
It's very complex, and it can be even more complex. And one of the things that I said early on was limited options, infinite iterations. If you think about every deal that you've worked on, every deal that you've been through, every company that you've seen after, all of them are different. Fundamentally the same, but the percentages are different. The strategic goals are different. The application of how they use the programs that's available under that are different. The leverage component that we talked about in the beginning, and then how they deal with dilution or non-dilutive options to continue to incent people to grow after the transaction takes place.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much complexity under the structure that it turns a lot of people off if they don't approach it with an open mind of, I'm just curious. I don't want to shut it down after, oh, it's complex, oh, it's expensive,
Mm-hmm.
it's weird, or it doesn't apply to me because I'm an LLC, and it says C or S, and so I'm just going to not explore it any further.
That's right.
And so that has a lot to do with it. And if you think about the governing bodies, right? So you've got ERISA, the Department of Labor, and the IRS. Tell me how many other structures all 3 of those folks are in from an ownership perspective.
None, right? Yeah. I think that's where I've always been like, I'm, like learning new things and all that. And I'm always been intrigued, but I think it's interesting how they are all involved. However, if you break it all down to its fundamental pieces and you just take one thing at a time, it's complex, but each of those pieces are not so complex. And I think the biggest thing I've always tried to do is get away from all the terminology and jargon that it's like anything. Like if I'm a tax professional and I talk IRS code sections, I'm probably going to lose most of the people in the room because how many people are reading the code? Right? Nobody, really.
Right.
But they need to understand what it means. So it's not like, hey, here's the code section, but here's what we could actually do with this. So everybody understands bonus depreciation because they do it every year. It's easy to understand, right? But that's all complicated code section. That's not simple. So I think the same thing in the ESOP community I've always hoped for is that the professionals start using language that's a lot more simplified and reduced down to what does it really do, instead of, hey, look how smart I am. That's more me criticizing the community, but look how smart I am because I can tell you about this, this, and this, and maybe lose you in 2 seconds, right? And that's really the focus of the podcast is to reduce everything down to what it really means when you get down to it. But I think it's super helpful to think about, like, I do think there always should be more, and I agree with all the things you came up with. I think education is always a big one. It feels more complex. The expensive stuff, I mean, I think that's an element we've talked about a lot. But when you kind of gravitate to the newness of this, when I think about expanding, and we kind of started off with private equities in this lane, ESOPs are in this lane, correct? Like here's 2 separate paths. Are you guys, were they looking at the kind of the hybrid version of that? Like how does private equity, because we kind of identified the fact that the financial community knows an ESOP company is typically a successful company because the employees are like, they get it, right? Mm-hmm. How does the private equity world merge into this without creating the worst part, which is what was a pure ESOP, right? Like we wanted to have control over what's happening and all that. So, I can see like the stair step, like we have this piece and then private equity comes in and blows it out, right? Are you guys talking about a hybrid version between the 2 things overlapping?
Great question. So everyone loves 100% S Corp ESOPs because no one likes paying taxes, right? So the structure is amazing. And the if you earlier on, I talked about the range of companies and what makes, that certain ones are going to be more attractive and have more options the larger that they are. And when we talk about an ESOP structure being 100% debt financed leverage buyout, then we talk about private equity and their model of a rate of return, and then capitalizing that on a specified period of time, usually. It doesn't always converge, right? So the higher the multiple, the less likely an ESOP structure works because it has to be financed with debt. The community, the private equity community can't operate on taking back seller notes to make sure that there's enough senior debt to spin off a company or to allow it to move on to its next stage or its next phase. And then when you're in that area of larger companies, multiples are going to be larger for those companies. And so that combination is like, well, how can you make that work? And that goes to look at a C Corp ESOP structure. And then how does that possibly open up certain ideas around utilizing the benefits of an ESOP in a partial structure to attract outside money? So it's not going to be 100% ESOP, but a partial C Corp ESOP is the idea, so that it attracts outside money and allows large companies for large multiples to utilize the benefit for workers, for the company, and all financial interests. And so it's really kind of a cohesive approach centered around the idea of getting everybody to the table.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me look at like the reduce it down to like what that could mean. So let me just give you kind of my thought case study kind of thing. You have a company that has a very high growth platform for the future. And we all know finance high growth means they're going to run out of cash, because clearly, double-digit growth or even triple, like it's going up like crazy, right? So the idea behind this is, hypothetically, this company maybe wants to use the ESOP as a partial, like a C Corp partial ESOP, sell a portion of it to, now we reconnect the people into the whole idea, use some of that money to get some of the chips off the table, at the same time, use it to raise some capital.
Yes.
So here is where the next phase comes from. So let's just say you do the transaction, they sell a portion of the company, they're partial at C Corp, we can use 1042 and all the other stuff. But the real play is, how do I do that and then get that company the capital it needs to fulfill and fund the growth? And then at that level, the private equity guys will kind of take it and sell off the whole thing. And the employees win because they get to be part of the ride as opposed to being left in the dust.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
So let's talk a little bit about, like, this is where, like, let's just say you have your company that is looking to do that. Let's just talk about the practical thing of, like, first off, number one, is it a good idea? Like, that's always, some people are going to just ask the question, should I do that? Or should I, what's the advantage there versus having a private equity company just come in and blow it all out now, right?
And those are questions that absolutely should be asked. And the structure, the idea, call it the idea, right? Because it's a working idea, on how to utilize those benefits to attract those players. And it's how do I get growth capital in? How do I get institutional money in? And I can't do that right now under today's ESOP structure because it just doesn't make any sense. So you're basically raising the marketplace or the population of eligible companies under this structure because it would attract the right capital at the right investment and the right IRR to allow that to go to the next stage or to grow, while also the goal, and both the goal and the byproduct is rewarding workers. So it's almost, it grows it from the top of the range of where an ESOP makes sense today up and out. And then it leaves room for the existing ESOP community and those companies that it would be good for today without changing anything. Back to those guiding principles. What do we want to accomplish as a group? That has to stay. We're only building the top end and then building out.
Cool. No, I think it's really a good topic, because I think some people would never probably thought about this until they listen to this. But One thought I have is I always try to categorize like what's in it for the shareholder, what's in it for the company, what's in it for the key people, what's in it for the employees when you get down to it. So if you think through this and you think just the conceptual side of this, we're going to use we go ESOP, partially C Corp ESOP, right? We're going to use that to raise capital. So that's at the end game is really to raise capital when you get down to it too, because we have a growth company, they're going to grow. What's in it for the shareholder to do that structure? And what are the risks to the shareholder? Like, let's just say they don't hit the growth numbers they thought they were going to hit. What are the risks and what's in it? What's the risk reward for the shareholder?
Great questions. So if we think about the employees first, right? Let's think about that. So um, their financial value is on that same trajectory, and it's aligned just like it would be with any ESOP company. And the tax benefits or ramifications of an ESOP structure are one of the attractions for that, right? So first, recognizing the power of people, and that if we were able to capture that element within this structure, then they get an outsized benefit in comparison, but we get our IRR in the structure. So when you take a look at the proposal in detail, and there are a lot of deep dives in there, I encourage you, if you're interested, to read it. It's really fascinating on why it makes sense that what's driving the boat is empowering workers and rewarding workers. And that produces that all of the access and all of the upside for an already incredible business that's producing those returns that could trade at that multiple. You're thinking about very successful companies with very large financial wherewithal that may be trapped inside of a larger organization, that may be trapped in a certain industry that can't go anywhere else without something an impetus, a catalyst. And the catalyst is how we get equity in the hands of workers while attracting capital, while growing to the next stage.
Yeah. What I like about it, and this is where I was thinking, I think it was a very good, like your point was really good. Like focus on the employee side, because first off, there's never been a time like this where it's so hard to hold on to people and, retain, incent them. That's one of the reasons I think ESOPs are becoming more and more popular. And one of the criticisms of ESOPs is how does it really attract a younger workforce? Because younger people maybe don't care about the retirement as much as obviously somebody that's older. But in this structure, what I like about it, what I would say is that I like the idea that I think it could attract younger people. And it could also be a real strong element for the key people that, you're wanting the key people to get really super excited about it, and which we're using all kinds of tools to do that, the SARs and different things like that. But if the key people understand, like this is capital that's going to be raised to get to this next level, everybody wins in that, because if everybody's focused on maybe the more of the dollar side of things as opposed to a 100-year company, then that could make sense. I think that could really resonate with, and then the shareholder wins because they're able to get some chips off the table, get the company to the next level, then participate in the next deal. Plus they bring their employees with them, and everybody, it should be, in my mind, it's always like, I always want the win-win-win-win. So I always want that across the board. And I always feel really bad if I start looking at something and it's a win-loss. Like, and I think that's honestly one of the things that I've seen in just pure private equity is that the employees seem to lose, because the company doesn't matter anymore. They're going to just sell it anyways. And eventually the employees just kind of lose because they're not really participating. So what I like about this is there's a way to connect the dots between some of the things that don't work wonderfully for ESOPs, which is how do I keep these young people super excited about the future? And so, if you're sharing that with them, like, great. I mean, maybe that will happen, right? So.
And the hope is that structure would continue in the next iteration of the next buyer, so those employees can continue to grow along with that company, whatever its end state ends up being. But you bring up a very important point, which, talking about the generations of different generations of people within ESOP companies and the meaning of the benefit and how that gets communicated. what's tangible and what's not. I'd say that in the last couple of years, that's become a very highly discussed topic, and it was part of this working group as well. How do we help that segment of the population with all that they're under to be successful under this? How does it address that?
Yeah. So, so I think it's something that as I think about this, as the only negative, if I'm the guy who's in charge of all that, one of the major things gets talked about too, just from a shareholder perspective, where they are inclined to go an ESOP, is they have a lot of control in the governance, and they're not having to deal with, first off, like if you just take personalities wise, like some companies that are run by people that have done this for 30 years, they're not really wanting to listen to another, strategic partner, right? In this scenario, I think that has to be dealt with at the front end. And I think people have to realize, like, the raise capital, you're going to deal with a financial partner, and the financial partner thinks like a financial person, and it may not be, that may be a deal killer for some people, but you're going to have to get over it or know that it's coming that way. So it's not the same old traditional ESOP where, hey, you're going to be on the board, you're going to have an independent board member, you're going to have a lot of control over governance. So the question and the comment, and then the question is more like, from your perspective, how does somebody, what should their expectation be in, maybe it's let's just say it's a 30% ESOP, non-controlling, percentage, C Corp, partial ESOP. Now they have a private equity partner. Well, they do a 30% ESOP, but then they raise capital, right? That debt, is that debt or is that equity?
So great distinction for us to kind of unpack. And so I don't think that this particular structure is going to lend itself to most individual shareholders or kind of the regular population of shareholders that are exploring ESOPs as an option, as an alternative to private equity. More, if we think about, I know here locally, we have a large publicly traded company that's had a number of spinoffs that have been their own company.
Right.
And a majority of the time, there's a lot of divisions that probably don't align with the core values of a large company that would be better served if they were on their own. But the mechanics of how that gets divested, who's interested in supporting that divestiture, who benefits from that divestiture, and then what are the tax ramifications for the owner and the divested company. And if it's just constantly plugging along as a going concern that's spinning off cash that rolls up, even if it's not aligned, why would they go through what's essentially a zero basis divestiture and then have to pay cap gains on that transaction? So if we think about that population, that's not one today that ESOPs are eligible for. But under this proposal, this idea, it would open that to a tax efficient way of getting the employees that are there, their stake in that transaction, while inviting equity and institutional investors, private equity, debt, other capital into the transaction to make it work at a multiple that makes sense. And so you have that employee base that would never benefit out in an outsized way before, that suddenly has a stake in their division in their company. And then if you multiply that across the larger companies that are here in the United States, there's a huge market where there just wasn't an option before. So that,
yeah, that's totally, my paradigm just changed. Like literally, I was thinking, because I wasn't thinking about that, right? That's a whole market that's not been in the ESOP focus at all. So, well, I love what you're saying, because I think it's like, those are companies that, like, yeah, this would be a great option, because you're going to use the tools to get through. Otherwise, what are they going to do, right? They're going to raise capital by the normal approach, right? Give up a lot, and the employees don't get anything. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So, well, we're almost out of time. Anything else you want to say, I guess, about the Expanding ESOP Initiative, or, for people to learn more? We're going to send some stuff on the website anyways for people to check that out. But anything else you want to kind of talk about relative to the meeting that you guys had and all the things that are coming next?
A lot of credit goes to the leaders that organize that event, those events, those conversations, ongoing conversations, in that effort to support employee ownership. And I would encourage everyone, I hope that I did it justice today in my trying to explain through with your questions, but I would encourage everyone to follow those resources, kind of catch the fire that you'll see on the segment that was published, and then dig through the deep dives on the website. And if you're curious, reach out through the website. I think you'll find a lot of really useful information there. But again, I'm very excited to be here, very excited to be part of this team and helping to bring the concept and the idea of employee ownership to everyone who wants to explore it. And so your first question on what's happening, like what is it popular? Is it increasing? And it is, and it's a great place to be. And if you have questions, just ask them, and remain curious for yourself and for the community at large, because as those leaders have demonstrated, we're better together and working toward a common cause. And all of that goes back to those pieces of how complex it can be on an individual basis and what it means to you, which is really important. But explore that, be curious, and participate and put your voices behind it.
Awesome. Good. Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it. For everybody else listening today, thank you for listening. Check us out at journeytoanesop.com for this episode. And then for all the information we just shared with you, that'll be on that website. So have a great day, and we'll see you on our next